presentation.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, if everyone would mute themselves if they're not already muted, it would be best so that we don't get peripheral noise. I will go for, half hour, 45 minutes or so. It's sort of off the cuff. I've got some notes in front of me that I'll be reading from, some quotes from the writings and so on. But first, I wanted to introduce you to this topic. From my point of view, there came a point in my academic career when I started turning my studies, or at least my research, towards the Baha'i faith because of a number of factors, but the main one being that I became very excited when I realized that I could, and this was, occurred, I became a Baha'i in 1960, and this occurred about, 1973 or so. The sort of epiphany, if you will. I realized that the fruit that my research into medieval English literature would be appreciated by a very small group of people whom were very isolated from the reality that as a Baha'i I was much more interested in. So I sort of separated my research and scholarly efforts from my vocation to a certain extent, though Baha'u'llah was gracious enough to see that I got academic credit for the Baha'i research I did through various means I won't try to go into. But suffice it to say, when I realized that I could apply the same tools and vigor with which I was studying literature to the works of Baha'u'llah, I simultaneously realized that I could also ask Baha'u'llah via the Baha'i authoritative writings any question I wanted, and if I focused my efforts, both conscious and unconscious, on those questions, the answers would become apparent. And so I tried to think, when I began this process, if Baha'u'llah were in the next room and I could go in and ask him anything I wanted, what would be the most interesting question to which he could give me the answer that I would love to have answered? Well, since that time, I've come across many questions, but the first one I came up with had to do with the topic you've asked me to speak on tonight, the purpose of physical reality, which turned into a presentation at the Association for Baha'i Studies in 1977, and finally was published as a book, which has gone through about 4 different editions. Excuse me. And is still available. And basically, the question went like this. If we are essentially spiritual beings, as Baha'is believe we are, associating with a physical mechanism, a physical body, and we are ultimately destined to dwell for the remainder of our lives, which is infinite in length, in the spiritual realm, then why this indirect journey, if you will? Why did God not create us already in the condition he desires us to be and have us go directly to that place? Well, in a sense, we are already in that place. As Baha'is theorize, or not theorize, but postulate from the authoritative text, the essential reality of the human being, as we just heard from those writings, is our soul, which is not in the body or contingent on the body or dependent on the body for its existence. Which gets right back to the question, then why do we go through this illusion that we are physical, and why are we put in an environment which seems pretty antithetical to our purpose? And that is, if we're meant to become disdainful of physical accolades and acquirements and status, why does God tempt us to be in a place where those things are so cherished? Excuse me. Well, of course, it's the hope and the aspiration, indeed, the destiny, Baha'is believe, of humankind to become, to create an environment that isn't tempting in those ways, that is spiritual, and that exalts those qualities that are, if not disdainful of physical reality, at least utilizes it for spiritual purposes rather than as something valuable unto itself. So that was the first question I pursued, and all the rest of the writing I have done has sort of followed along those same lines. The question that followed that, and the question that followed that. And the questions keep coming and the answers keep coming, and so I keep writing. I've got one coming out in August on an exploration of the Surrey Hakel, as the body of God, as not the Surrey Hakel itself, but the book is titled The Body of God, and I'll explain what that's about in a minute. But let's deal with this first topic and what answer I derive from my studies and prayers and meditation. As we heard in the writings that were just read, it is clear in a number of places in the Baha'i writings that the entire focus of this massive physical construct that is physical reality, the bounds of which we still don't understand. In fact, the writings say there are none, that it is infinite in time, infinite in space and plenitude. We have in the writings read that everything in physical reality has something to teach us about the spiritual realm. And I'll read you a passage from the Gleanings with which you're probably well familiar, but it brings to mind the explicit statement by Baha'u'llah to the effect that everything has a spiritual attribute or a combination of attributes, which can, if we study it and meditate on it and act with it, can teach us something if we're discerning. Know thou that everything is a sign of the revelation of God. Each according to its capacity is and will ever remain a token of the Almighty, inasmuch as he, the sovereign Lord of all, hath willed to reveal his sovereignty in the kingdom of names and attributes, which means physical reality. Each and every created thing, through the act of the divine will, hath been made a sign of his glory. So pervasive and general is this revelation that nothing whatsoever in the whole universe can be discovered that doth not reflect his splendor. Under such conditions, every consideration of proximity and remoteness are obliterated. Were the hand of divine power to divest this high endowment of all created things, the entire universe would become desolate and void. In other words, not only does everything in creation have this capacity, without this capacity, these objects wouldn't exist. Now, this gets to another question that we're going to end up with, and I'll leave that for later. But what I came to realize is that the purpose of a physical experience, if you will, is to utilize our own free will or participation in our own spiritual enlightenment. That in effect, if you were placed in a spiritual environment without any preparation and just made, okay, this person is a good person and here he is in a spiritual environment, you wouldn't know how you got there. You wouldn't know what value it had in comparison to not having it. In effect, you would have a certain static capacity, but you wouldn't have the tools with which to advance further. And that's what physical reality does by veiling to us the messages it has to teach us, both the individual objects within it, and more importantly, the complex of human society, where we are trying collectively on this planet and every planet where there's human life to develop a replica in physical and social terms of the qualities and attributes of the spiritual realm. And so I came in my first discussion of this in the book called The Purpose of Physical Reality to describe the physical world as a classroom, and the objects in that classroom being everything we encounter, and the lessons that we learn being primarily our interplay with other people as we acquire the different virtues and attributes that refine us as spiritual beings. There's a passage where, and it's a beautiful statement and a rather remarkable tablet to Auguste Forel by Abdu'l-Baha, where he calls the physical world this great workshop. So let me read a part of what he says to Forel, who was an incredibly brilliant man, was not a Baha'i at the time. And so it gets into proofs about causality and the proofs about the existence of God and a number of other things. The consummation of this limitless universe with all its grandeur and glory hath been man himself, who in this world of being toileth and suffereth for a time with diverse ills and pains, and ultimately disintegrates, leaving no trace nor fruit after him. He's talking about the physical process. Were it so, there is no doubt that this infinite universe with all its perfection has ended in a sham and delusion with no result, no fruit, no permanence, no effect. It would be utterly without meaning. They were thus convinced that such is not the case, the philosophers were, that this great workshop with all its power, its bewildering magnificence and endless perfections cannot eventually come to naught. That still another life should exist is thus certain. And just as the vegetable kingdom is unaware of the world of man, so we too know not the great life hereafter that followeth the life of man here below. The sense of this can be summed up even more succinctly by another statement by Abdu'l-Baha, which states the following: that each of the physical world and the spiritual world are the exact counterpart of each other. The spiritual world is like unto the phenomenal world. They are the exact counterpart of each other. Whatever objects appear in the world of existence are the outward pictures or reflections or shadows. He uses several analogies to say this, of the world of heaven. Now, this concept that this world is, if you will, a physical, metaphorical, or symbolic representation of the spiritual world means that we not only have temptations, but we also have objects for instruction. But how do we know the difference? Well, this, of course, is where the manifestations come into play. The concept of the Baha'i faith that all the religions of God are one religion revealed in progressive and successive stages, and that each of these teachers comes to advance the collective body politic, which is the student in this classroom. Now, these twin aspects of reality then, the spiritual and the physical, as I said in the beginning, are not only manifest in us with our soul from which derives our consciousness, our free will, our rational capacities, our memory, everything that distinguishes us as human beings is a property or capacity or power of the soul, which means, in effect, the human brain is not the cause of consciousness. It is rather an intermediary, a transceiver, if you will, between the soul and the body. So when the brain is no longer operant, the soul exists on its own without the body. So it is our purpose in this life to do two things. Now, this comes right from the very first paragraph of the Kitab-i-Agnas. It's sort of a preamble to the entire book. It basically says, in addition to all the specific laws, ordinances, and exhortations I'm going to prescribe for you, there is overriding these laws one crucial duty for you, regardless of whether you're a Baha'i or not a Baha'i. The first of these is to recognize the manifestation or teacher that is your teacher for this grade level, this day, this dispensation. The second obligation that each individual has is to follow the laws and guidance that they provide for you. But then there's a third aspect to this exhortation or this overriding law. Neither is acceptable without the other. They are reciprocal. And furthermore, they are reciprocal in their capacity to enhance each other. So the more you know about a virtue, the more you are capable of implementing it in various kinds of personal interaction with others. The more you do or express or act out that virtue, the more you understand about it. And so this is sort of reciprocity that gets ever more eloquent and refined as we go through life, if we follow the lessons and do our job. So this counterpart relation between the physical and the spiritual is kind of the brief answer that I began to understand, that physical reality is a necessary step between our life in our first life, our life in the womb, and our life in the hereafter. It's a necessary learning process so that we will not be in some static condition, but will have developed tools wherewith we can continue to develop in the life to come and continue to serve. So this dual aspect of this exhortation, even though we will not have a physical body in the next world, because of the interplay between the spiritual world and the physical world, we still will have acts of service. You remember, I'm sure those of you who are Baha'is, that in the Tablet of Ahmad, how Baha'u'llah has Ahmad pray for or exhort God for a service in both worlds as a reward for his response to the tablet. And the tablet was a teaching tablet, an exhortation for Ahmad. Even though he was approaching Adrianople to see Baha'u'llah, he got this tablet, which he called the Tablet of the Nightingale. And he immediately understood, even though many Baha'is can read it and have no clue what it's about, because it's an abstruse tablet. It's very symbolic, very poetic. But he knew exactly what it meant. And it meant that he was supposed to go back to Persia and spend the rest of his life, which was 100 years or more, teaching the Baha'i faith to the Babis, who had not yet had opportunity to see Baha'u'llah and realize that Baha'u'llah had pronounced himself as him whom God will make manifest, the successor that was foretold by the Bab. So, the universe is, from a Baha'i point of view, a term designating not just the physical world, but the entire creation. What Baha'u'llah calls in one meditation, the greater and lesser worlds, the spiritual and the physical. And so just as we as individuals in our present experience are comprised of dual parts, if you will, our physical body, which acts out our spiritual intentions. So the creation itself consists of the spiritual and the physical. And as I quoted the passage earlier, it means that each is the counterpart of the other. So everything that exists in one is replicated in the other, in the physical world, in a metaphorical form. And since it's metaphorical or veiled or symbolic, the job for us comes, how can we discern the meaning beneath the literal level? Now, this, of course, if you've read the Igan, you will recall that at the very outset of that work, the Book of Certitude, Baha'u'llah says, the main cause of the failure of religions of the past to recognize the succeeding religion and manifestation has been the inability of the clerics and the divines to understand the spiritual or symbolic nature of scripture or divine utterance. And so they took it literally. And so the first half of the Igan, Baha'u'llah explicates 3 verses from Matthew that foretell the coming of Muhammad as articulated by Christ. And these 3 verses talk about the stars falling and so on. And he explains the smoke and the various other signals that will herald the advent of the manifestation of God and the day of judgment. And, or actually the advent of Muhammad in particular, but also there are other passages that herald the advent of the Bab. And that's what the Igan is ultimately about. It is, as Shoghi Effendi said, an apologia for the Babi faith. And what is an apologia? It means a defense of, a proof of. So the Igan is a proof of the validity of the claims of the Bab. And it ends with 4 or 5, you can divide them up differently, proofs that he summarizes at the end. And the first of those proofs is the utterance or the word that the manifestation utters. But if you don't understand the words, if you take them literally and not in their hidden meaning, you have no clue as to what's going on. To give you but one very salient and pertinent example, you have this perversion of Christianity that occurs understandably, but unfortunately, which sort of creates a degree of chauvinism in Christianity with regards to religions prior to it and religions that succeeded. And that is, Philip, when Christ is about to be crucified, this is from John, the book of John, Christ tells them that he's about to leave them and he's going to the Father. Well, they don't know what he's talking about because they too, as Jews, are literalist. And they said, what are you talking about? And Philip says in particular, show us the Father and we'll be satisfied. In other words, let us see who you're going to and we won't, be confused. And Christ's response is, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father, for I am in the Father and the Father is in me. So ask me not, show us the Father. You have been with me, you've seen what I've done, you know as much of the Father as can be shown to you. This is another axiom of the Baha'i teachings, and that is that the closest proximity we can attain to God is nearness to the manifestation. Now, of course, that doesn't mean physical nearness. It means spiritual nearness, which is achieved by reading and studying their utterances, following their teachings, and communing. If you want to get to know someone, you talk to them, you get to understand about them. You study their lives, you study what they say, what they do. One of the readings that was chosen for tonight about the essence of divine unity is seeing in the manifestation everything he does and says is the same as if it were coming from God. And Shoghi Effendi in another passage says even more specifically that not just in this world, but in the world to come, God is too much, well, of course, he's infinite, but he's too great for us to understand that we will always need the intermediary of the manifestations for us to understand God, because there's, of course, one of the very commonplace metaphors we use, Baha'is do in teaching others about the Baha'i faith, is that the manifestations are like flawless or perfect mirrors reflecting the attributes of the divine reality that is God. So they're not incarnations of God, but they are incarnations of the attributes of God. So on the one hand, the physical world is secondary in one sense. It is the lesser world, but the kingdom is, if you will, the real world. Abdu'l-Baha says, know that the kingdom is the real world, and this nether place, it's only its shadow stretching out. A shadow hath no life of its own. Its existence is only a fantasy and nothing more. It is but images reflected in water and seeming as pictures to the eye. But this doesn't mean that these pictures have no value. They are, again, a teaching device whereby we can understand the source of the light that's casting the shadow. Well, I'm going to finish with a couple of other axioms that relate to this concept of the purpose of physical reality, because, as I said, it is very much like an educational, well, it is an educational system. It is systematic, and we often, as Baha'is, utilize as in teaching others the concept of progressive revelation, the analogy to a grade school where each manifestation is like a teacher in the different levels of learning. And so we don't see one teacher as more important or is smarter than the other teachers. They just have a different job because the student has progressed to a different level. So you don't disdain the previous teacher. They prepared you for the next teacher. And in that sense, all of the prophets are in this station of unity, equal to one another. None exceeds the other. But because they come at different times, some come at more critical times than others. And as the Baha'i writings state, this particular time in our collective education, and this is another point in this idea of physical reality as a place of education. It is education for the individual, and it is an education for the collectivity, the body politic, the civilization on Earth. So we're all assisting our own education, but individual enlightenment and spirituality is inaccessible without our relationship with others. Spiritualization is necessarily a social enterprise. And so I wrote another book following this, which was called The Ascent of Society, which dwells on that point, that all individual education necessarily resides on or emanates from our exercise of virtue, and virtue almost inevitably involves relationships with others. You want to be just? Well, if you want to practice it, you've got to show it, manifest it, exercise it with others. You want to be kind, you want to be generous, and so on. Almost every virtue, not all of them, but almost everyone is necessarily socially understood and exercised. This is one of the reasons that Baha'u'llah forbids asceticism and mysticism, because they are, while noble in their origins in some cases, because they require a great deal of effort and restraint, are based primarily on isolating oneself from society and from social activity. So the idea is that you want to get away from all material concerns, all material distractions, and simply focus on prayer, meditation, and so on. Well, you're not doing your exercises, all right? You're not practicing, you're not utilizing physical reality. You're disdaining physical reality, which, as we've just said, excuse me, at the outset, is spiritual in itself. Well, let me close with one final thought, and this is something that I plan on writing about in the future. And this has to do with the very precise way in which these two realms or two dimensions of reality are coordinated. Because this has to do with the purpose of physical reality as well. Scientists, as you may know, have through the years tried to determine what the universe is like, how big it is, what its origin is, what its limitations may be, what forces organize it. Is it organized? Is it just, and of course, a strictly materialist view of physical reality seems to obviate the necessity of having a creator or a God or some being that has some divine purpose in mind. It's caused by a sequence of other causes. The Baha'i writings say that's not so. First of all, from a Baha'i perspective, the term universe doesn't simply mean the physical world. It means everything that exists, whether in this world or the world to come. And as we've just heard, the Baha'i writings say these two worlds are coordinated, one with the other. They are counterparts, each one the expression of the other. If you want, you might symbolically say that since God is unknowable and the way we know him is by physical experience and through these teachers, you might say almost that the universe itself is like God's body, not literally, but in a figurative manner. And from what does that derive? Well, here we get to something that we really don't have time to discuss tonight, but it's the most important discussion that you can have, and that is, what is the origin of God's reason for creation? So we know why he creates physical reality, because it's a teaching device. And we know what it's trying to teach us is trying to make us spiritual. And why is it trying to make us spiritual? Because that is the most refined and happy and fulfilled we can become. But why does God feel the need to create anything? That's another talk altogether, and it has to do with the hadiths of the hidden treasure, why God brought creation into being. And what we discover is he did that in the same way a parent desires to have children, the good parent, a noble parent. And the answer is it's not to fulfill some personal or narcissistic desire, not with a good parent, but because you want to share love with a being that can benefit from that love. And you hope that they love you, but they may not. You can't impose love, and this is another axiom. You can't impose love on another being. So God himself says to us through Baha'u'llah, love me that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. So in other words, while God is ever ready to bestow his love upon us and reward us for our seeking him out, he's not going to force us. We have free will. And so you have the same relationship between a parent and child, don't you? That the parent can give the child every benefit, every bit of wise love and so on. But ultimately, at a certain point, the child will have free will. I always am fond of alluding, especially to parents who have had children, and maybe not all of them were perfect spiritual beings. In fact, I've rarely run into anyone where they had a case where they all were. Note that the exemplar of our faith, Abdul Baha, all the children who endured were female, and none of them were faithful to the covenant. And he was the exemplar. So I presume he was a decent parent. He certainly manifests that in his relationship with Shoghi Effendi, doesn't he? Even though he was his grandfather. So again, let me not get too far entrenched into this analogy. You get the point. And that is the reason, one of the more fascinating subjects you can pry into and think about on your own is the reason for God wanting to bring about creation and the tools. You can almost say this, and this is a talk that I gave last week in another Fireside. Everything in creation derives from the logic underlying God's wish to be known. Abdul Baha explains this in an explication of the Hadith of the Hidden Treasure, the heart of which is in the notes to the Kitabi Agdas, where he says there are three stages in this process. The first is the stage of being hidden, concealed, or veiled.
On the lights.
I beg your pardon? So I was alone, the way that Hadith goes. I wish to be known, therefore I brought creation into being that I might be known. So Abdul Baha says the first stage is that of being concealed. This is prior to the manifestation receiving the intimation that it's time for his revelation to begin. The second stage is that of, therefore, I wish to be known, and so he unveils himself. He declares himself, and then I brought creation into being has to do with the laws, the ordinances, and so on, that he might be known. It's a very interesting discussion. It's from a tablet called the Commentary on the Hadith of the Hidden Treasure. Well, I've said quite enough, I think, for one sitting. I think you get the idea of what I meant by the concept of the purpose of physical reality as a teaching device, as a necessary teaching device, and really the only way that God could bring about the precise results that he desires to have, namely beings who freely choose to know him and to worship him. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can put them on the chat, and someone can read them out to me, or you can unmute yourself, whatever the procedure you use, Shokapi.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was a fascinating talk, and I really cannot appreciate enough of what you talked about. It's just absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure that if you agree, we are going to have you more, Dr. Hatcher. It would
Thank
be
you.
our pleasure. So if you please, everyone, you can either raise your hand and unmute yourself, and ask your questions. I think that would be the best if you do that. And there is, if you go to the reaction, there is a place that it says raise hand. You can do that. And then ask your question, please.
By the way, Smokey, I hadn't seen you in 40 years. You look a little different. The last time I remember seeing you, I may have seen you since, but you were a friend of my son when you both were about 14, and you went surfing over at Sebastian Inlet, I believe.
I remember it well. Those were
Yeah. Well, he now is a professor of journalism in Duluth at the University of Minnesota at Duluth, but he has just in the last 2 years bought a farm. In addition to being professor, he has become they have a collective farm there, he and his wife, in outside Duluth. So I'll tell him that I saw you, and maybe we can put you in touch with each other, and you can share what your lives have been like.
I will leave my contact on the chat, and I would absolutely love that.
Oh, he would too. He would too.
Yeah, thank you.